Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us at this special online event for the Off the Shelf Festival in Sheffield. We're here to talk about this magnificent, strange, unusual book, Caliban Shrieks, that's just been republished by Vintage earlier this year and written by Jack Hilton. And because of that, but not only because of that, I'm joined by two other Jacks who are going to shed some light on it. We're going to chat about the book. And more importantly, we're going to hear some of the words on the air as well and kind of get them into the room. So I'm joined by Jack Windle and Jack Chadwick, both of whom we're going to hear from and chat to in a little bit. But Jack Windle, first of all, before we kind of get into Caliban Shrieks and the book and who Jack Hilton was, I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about your interest in Jack Hilton, who he was a little bit, and also I think we're going to hear an extract of his own writing that maybe gives a little bit of context for the audience about who he was, and we'll take it from there.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, I first became interested in Jack Hilton many years ago now when I was doing my master's. I went along to a Talk About the North seminar at Leeds Met and was chatting to Ben Clark, who's actually at the University of North Carolina, about undiscovered working class texts. And he recommended Caliban Shrieks to me and said that he thought it was a really overlooked masterpiece, you know. So I went away and I think like Jack Chadwick, when I first sat down to read it, I couldn't put it down and pretty much consume the whole thing in one sitting. And I then went on to become fascinated with the book. I wrote a chapter of my PhD thesis on it. And I'm really, really passionate about the book, but also about Jack Hilton himself and the incredible life that he led. Jack was born in 1900. He was one of a number of siblings that he's not sure of. And I think that's an important point here because it's very hard to pin down the facts about people from very poor backgrounds. From that time, infant mortality was so high that he didn't really get to know many of his own siblings. So I think that's a really important kind of piece of information about his life. He became very active with the National Unemployed Workers Movement in the 1930s. And through his activism, he ended up doing a couple of stints in jail and actually being bound over to keep the peace for 3 years, I think. And that kind of led him to start writing down his experiences, which is how this incredible book came about. So I'm going to read just a short excerpt it's actually from an unpublished autobiography called Caliban Boswelling that's in Hilton's papers, which are held at the University of Nottingham's archive. By the winter of 1933, essay writing had led me to writing about present day things. The effort wasn't for publication, for I had none of that kind of vanity. It was simply the eviction from the bowels of what I wanted to say and never expected others to read. Ignorance is bliss. If I'd known a tweeny weeny bit about the lit world or had thought of publishing, I never would have dared to write a word. I couldn't spell three-syllable words. Sentences didn't make sense. Order I did not know. All I did know was that if chucking the soapbox socialist game had stopped me from speaking aloud, I could talk to myself quietly and put this on paper. And so I was the mass man recording his experiences in the present century. And I think that just captures really, really well his struggle to master English, which is a recurring theme through certainly a lot of his unpublished work, and his commitment to voicing his experience as a working class person in the 1930s.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And that was Jack Windle reading, as he was just saying there, an unpublished excerpt from this unpublished autobiography that's held in the archives at the University of Nottingham. And I think we'll come back to the idea that Jack Windle was just raising for us there about this sense of, it seems to me Jack Hilton is a writer kind of permanently undiscovered, but permanently being rediscovered in all these different ways, kind of through these different generations and different attempts to bring the work back into the light, to kind of bring new readers to the work. But Jack Chadwick, kind of that helps, I think, in this pivot towards you, because part of this latest rediscovery, as it were, of Jack Hilton and of Caliban Shrieks, and this gorgeous new edition that Vintage Classics have just put out earlier this year, came about because of your kind of intrepid work, kind of tracking down the estate, kind of tracking down who owned the rights to the work, and kind of bringing it back to the light. And before we get into the book, I just wondered if you wanted to tell us a little bit both about how you came to Jack Hilton, but then also how you brought Jack Hilton to Vintage and then therefore back to the shelves of bookstores all over the country.
Well, previously, the only way I've been able to really explain this, and it's not really an explanation, it's just by pointing to the fact that it all came about through a series of, for lack of a better word, just flukes, right? So it was a fluke that I one day, just after the end of lockdown, well, one of the lockdowns at least, I'd been unemployed all throughout the lockdowns. And I think I decided to go to the, one of the local libraries, the Working Class Movement Library in Salford, to have a crack at doing some of the fulfilling some of your duties as a job seeker, right? So I bought my dingy old laptop with me, and I set up on a big wooden table of the Working Class Movement Library's reading room. I can't remember what I was intending to do that day, but I think I just wanted a change of scene, really. I'd been out of work for so long. I'd been just in my apartment for a long while. The clubs that I'd worked at previously were all still shut. So I don't know what I was intending to do, but I ended up on this table. And before I'd even, started doing anything relevant to work search, I just had glanced from the corner of like my vision, the cover of this a book that looked completely out of place, when you take it in contrast to all of the other stuff in the room at the time. You're talking like trade union archival material, big boxes full of like of old like quite boring looking tombs. This book though was yellow, and it had this weird sort of design on the cover that I just couldn't make out from where I was sitting. So I went over and picked it up, and I saw, it was a skeleton. I saw the title, Caliban Shrieks. I saw a little annotation saying me. I noticed the skeleton on the cover was reaching up for so I couldn't really tell. I don't know if it was the sun or if it was bread. And that he was wearing jeans. I opened the book and went to the first section of the preface, and the rest of my day just melted into this dusty old book. But when I say dusty, it was falling apart. I had to be really, really careful with it. Since then, it's been refurbished, I don't know if that's a word, professionally. So it's going to last for hopefully another 100 years. But at the time, this was a first edition, so it was falling to pieces. So I discovered this book that I had no idea about. When I thought the best person to ask would be the one actually just in the next room, the head librarian, who is this authority on like working class culture in the north of England in particular, and she, Lindsay, who's become a really good friend of mine. She had nothing really to tell me aside from just to sort of pepper in more mystery into this book, saying, but I don't really know anything about this author aside from that he is a mystery, which you can imagine after I'd read it. I read it in 2 goes, which for me as a slow reader is incredible. It's the fastest I've ever read anything in my life. Basically, the mystery sort of just deepened from that point. I did some Googling, and that came up with Jack Windle's earlier search, right? But had made it into the pages of the Manchester Evening News and the Oldham Chronicle, I think. So that then led to this thread, which I pulled further. I was able to find out from talking to some people. I think one of them was Andy Croft, the poet, the working class poet. I think I found out from him, or perhaps it was even from Jack Windle's blog, that there is something pointing to like the area of Oldham. And so I'd been through all of the other sort of approaches you could take to this kind of question of like looking on ancestry.co.uk and find my past, blah, 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 all these different sources for archival material about people who are long dead. And it hadn't turned up anything because of the sorry state of like record keeping and the fact that a lot of it hasn't been digitized, etc. Um, so the last thing I could think of doing was printing out posters with those little tassels at the bottom where you can cut it up, pull it off, and it's got like a phone number. And I printed out these posters and went around the pubs of Oldham, going away from Manchester up Broadway, which is the road that takes you to Rochdale, the bus route. So I went through all these pubs and asked if I could put up a poster. I went through about 3 pubs before I got to the Sportsman's Arms, which is I think it's like the third pub I was trying to get to out of like 5 possibilities. And just as I was explaining to the woman behind the bar what I was trying to do, and I was, by the way, I was quite drunk at this point. I'd had like at least 4 pints because I'd been going in having one, and it was just a one-man pub crawl. None of my friends wanted to come to Oldham with me. So I was doing it by myself and making conversation with the people at the bars. And from behind this like weirdly strategically placed pillar, right, there was someone earwigging when I was talking to the barroom. And she just sort of like leaned forward past this pillar and was like, hang on a minute, I think I know, did you say Bill? And I think I knew you on about. And she didn't know Jack Hilton, but she knew Jack Hilton's best mate from the time when he, at the end of his life, used to drink in this pub, right, the Sportsman's Arms. Since then, it's undergone like 2 changes of management. It's even gone a little bit up, into sort of vaguely gastropub territory, as gastropub as you could get in the area, at least. It does pizzas now. So I've not been able to track down this woman who was there. And in fact, the managers and the staff behind the bar have changed as well. So this is another mystery. This woman disappeared into nothing afterwards, but she was able to tell me this name, Bill Hassel, right? So I then looked him up and found an address which was just around the corner. I then went over and on the back of one of the posters, I knocked on, there was no response. On the back of one of the posters, I wrote what I was after, put it through the letterbox. This is another fluke, right? The woman who lived there, Bill's like widow, because he died a year before. She was just on the cusp of moving out. She'd had everything was in boxes already. So if I'd been a little bit late, it would have just the note I put through would have been lost in the like maelstrom of takeaway leaflets and stuff that you get in a house that's unoccupied. From there, I wrote an article for Manchester Mill about what I'd found. And then that article led to media invitations to talk about Caliban Shrieks and Jack Hilton on the BBC, in some of the national broadsheets, and listening to one of those, I think it was the BBC Front Row segment, which was in September, a few months after the article I wrote came out, was Nick, the lovely Nick from the managing director of Vintage Classics at Penguin, who was staggered by the fact that, at the end of a piece on Front Row, there wasn't this happy announcement of, and we found a publisher. He was like, what? This has got this much media attention without any kind of, formal publicity department or whatever, which I think is really something that's a fluke in and of itself, that people heard about it and it just percolated, I think is the word, like in a way that managed to get it to the right ears. And so a year and a half after that, the book is published with Vintage Classics, and it did phenomenally well. And it's now we're at a point where it's done so well, it became like the #1 title for Vintage for the month it was published. And it got to a point where now we're able to say, actually, we're going to bring out more, right? So at the moment, I'm working on a biography of Hilton to accompany some of his other writings, some of which are unpublished. And it's fascinating. So I've gone back to that kind of like research stage that I was in for when I was writing your article. Apologies if I'm going on a bit long. It's actually
this is great. I mean, we'll probably come back, I think, to what's forthcoming, that biography and things like that. But it's just such a remarkable story, I think, of how it kind of came into being, and kind of building on the knowledge, as you say, of like that Jack Windle had been doing, that these other kind of thinkers and scholars had kind of been doing, this kind of collaborative effort. the kind of community effort to
four
bring
generations, right? And I think, Jack, you got the longest, and as I've said to you before, none of this would have happened at any stage without the work of yourself. And then before you, I think there's a lot of credit to go to people like Andy Croft as well, who was sort of, if you want to put it in terms of generations, like the first generation to try and get Hilton back into print. It's a collaborative effort. Definitely.
And Andy Croft, we should say, runs the brilliant Smokestack publishing, who publish kind of really exciting and innovative poetry. Chad Windle, I wanted to come back to you just because we've been kind of hearing, I think, a bit about now how this book's come back into being, and we keep mysteriously describing the book or Caliban Shrieks. But I think that what would be really great is to kind of maybe just, I don't think, is it possible to sum this book up? I'm not really sure. Certainly I kind of never managed when I wrote the introduction to this new edition. But just to maybe kind of give us a little bit about what Caliban Shrieks is as a book, and then maybe readers from the beginning of it, again, just so that we can sort of hear what it is that we're kind of wrestling with, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah. Just very briefly to touch on, the fact that it's kind of been many people over a long period of time. That's entirely in keeping with the history of working class literature. It's dependent upon recovery, right? We wouldn't have the Ragged Trousers Philanthropists if it weren't for Fred Ball and lots of other people. We wouldn't have the Songs of Joseph Mather, who's a very important Sheffield writer. So there's so much literature that could have been lost, and it's only there because people care about this tradition and put in the work to bring things back to life. To the book, what is Caliban Shrieks? Well, an impossible question. I think one of the reasons that it's really stands out in the context of the 1930s is that during the 30s, it was the era of the proletarian novelist. There were lots of them. Heslop, Greenwood, Summerfield, many others. Lewis Jones, who wrote Comedy, Lewis Grassic Gibbon. There's many working class novelists out there. And this book isn't really a novel. It doesn't fit into that. If you go into the archive and look into Walter Greenwood's Love on the Dole, for example, probably the most successful working class novel of the 1930s, in fact, definitely. Greenwood it took him years to get that into print. He was getting rejection after rejection after rejection, and he had to modify what he was writing to cater for the novel buying public. Now, Hilton, the reason that it's such a remarkable book is that he didn't do any of that. As we've already learned from the excerpt that I read, he had none of the vanity of thinking that anybody else would ever read it. What happened was he started attending WEA classes. He got really into reading. He was rushing from inarticulacy to eloquence, as he phrases it very memorably at one point. And through these WEA classes, he started doing essays, really, for to develop his own writerly skill, if you like. And many of them are autobiographical, some of them much more polemical. There's long poems, there's all sorts of different fragments. And the genesis of the book was that he handed in his essays to his WEA tutor, who loved them, and he basically sent them off to the Adelphi, which was a left-leaning journal at the time. They loved it, published an essay, and Hilton's version of events is that he didn't know that was going to be published. He just received a copy in the post. So it was accidentally published, his first piece. And the editor said, "We love this. We think that there's scope for more. What else have you got?" And his words in Caliban Boswell are, "I had nothing else other than my efforts in my penny exercise books. So I sent them off." And basically, with a bit of polishing, that's what led to Caliban Shrieks. And that's why it's many different types of book all in one. So the first section's very autobiographical. There's bits that are definitely working class history. As I've said, there's a long poem about the cooperative pioneers. There's real political polemics. There's a fantastic chapter called "They Called Themselves Comrades," which basically George Orwell ripped off for the end of The Road to Wigan Pier. And Hilton really didn't write it as a single cohesive piece. It was produced as those fragments, and he kind of stitched it together. And one of the things that's amazing about it is the kind of duality of voice, if you like, that he achieves. Because he's talking about me as in personally, as in an autobiographical, traditional autobiography. But he's also talking about we, as in it's about his class and his experience as a member of that class and his commitment to class politics and his little group, his pals in Rochdale who they'd, got really active in the NUWM and they were trying to make something of it and make something of the movement. So I think it's unique in that respect, in that it was never conceived of as a book, and it accidentally ended up as one. And that's why, and this like really comes off the page at you when you read it. But what's going on here? This is not like anything I've read before. Is pretty much everyone's reaction to it.
I'm glad it wasn't just me then when I first got sent it to read.
No, absolutely not. I spent many years researching working class literature, and there's nothing like this at all. So shall I give you a little bit from the beginning of it?
Yes, please. Let's hear some. Let's get it in the air.
Okay, so this is from the opening chapter. There is a little introductory bit that he sets up the kind of Caliban metaphor, but I think this is probably a better introduction to the more autobiographical elements of the story, of the book. I first saw light in the year 1900, most likely by chance, resulting out of what is possibly the overindulged enjoyment of the sexes. It was, I am informed, a very snowy day. That may be the reason I am rarely cold. My mother would be then 25 and my dad 10 years older. There had been 5 children previously, and of course, being one of Fortune's favourites, my birth came to pass in a back street in a smoky industrial town. From about 5, I began to have contact with my species, and the thing I remember most was the cruelty of it. I lacked infant aggressiveness, and as child life is composed of physical improvement such as fighting, exercising, getting bigger and stronger, my absence of this natural drive to maturity made me the sport of the kids of various alleyways we were constantly moving in and out of. Brackets. You all know, I presume, that moonlights were common events about 1905 to 1914. Somehow, I could never strike first, and if I did defend, it generally stopped at that. This was quite the goods for the little tinkers. How they enjoyed the jungle freedom to sock me. I think the softy amongst a group of boys is grossly misjudged. What leatherings he takes, and he gets plenty, and ever there is a continued more in the offing. Still, conditions make the man, and being the receiver general hardens one for the future. I think just my immediate response to that piece is that it gives you an idea of his tone. There's a real levity to it. He's often dealing with serious stuff. He's getting beaten up a lot, extreme poverty, and it's got this kind of skip along, quite humorous pace to it. That's often a little bit that, it doesn't quite fit together. And that really drives the prose in a lot of places. And also something that's really important in there is that parentheses. You all know, I presume, that moonlights were common in this period. What he's doing there, and this is something that Walter Greenwood does and other writers in the 30s do, is he's setting up a dual audience. He's saying, people who share my experience, and I'm talking to you. And he's kind of positioning the middle class reading public who are going to end up buying this book, saying, you didn't know that. You have no idea about my experience. And he's setting up this duality of different audiences for his work that I think is a really, really interesting feature as the book develops.
I mean, that duality, I think, there's so much I want to pick up on in that, but I think that duality that you just mentioned is so interesting throughout it because you really feel, as me sat here as a middle-class kind of academic reading it, you feel incredibly implicated. There's a you in the book that's kind of pointing off the page. Well, you won't understand this, you people or you kind of readers. There's a real sense in which, as you say, he has this, for someone who is an autodidact and for somebody who kind of doesn't have dreams of being published, I guess, as you've kind of explained to us, this real sense of who a book buying or kind of literature reading audience would be. And if not a contempt, a real kind of sense of how he holds them and what they need to know. Would that be fair to say, Jack Mindell?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think in They Call Themselves Comrades, where he's really lambasting kind of book socialists, he calls them, There's this really clever disarming bit where he says, "And I should know because I'm one of them." And that I think is really interesting. He's really, really self-aware, and he knows that he's from this working class background. He's nominated himself as being the voice of the lumpen man, as we see in that extract from Caliban Boswell in at the beginning. But he also understands that he's cramming. He's trying to become a writer. Okay. Like after this book was published, he ended up at Ruskin College. And then he really did have a writerly ambition. He wanted to be a novelist. He wanted to get his feet under the table, which is a metaphor he uses. So yeah, there's a lot going on in this book about the positionality of him as this kind of if you like, kind of authentic, direct voice, but knowingly playing with that and his relationship to the reader or the imagined reader of the book as well. So it gives it lots of layers, and it makes for a lot of very interesting and very amusing bits.
Definitely. And Jack Chadwick, I kind of want to pick up just in a second about some of those bits and kind of ask you maybe for a kind of particular favourite or interesting passage that then we can chat about and we might hear from. But Jack Windle, just to kind of finish off on that first little bit, Orwell and Walter Greenwood came up quite a lot in that. And they're then two names, I think, particularly obviously Orwell, who's passed from metaphor into cliche, it seems to me now in kind of contemporary culture, which is a name that people will know. Walter Greenwood's Love on the Dole, I think, is a novel that a lot of the audience will know, and actually is still one of my favorite novels in some ways. I think it's incredibly moving. But what is it about, and you kind of gave us a little bit of this idea of Greenwood having a sense of an audience that he was writing towards in order to get published. You get a kind of very traditional arc in certain ways in Love on the Dole. Orwell, but I wonder, what is it about those two names that meant they survived, whereas Hilton has been kind of, as we were talking about before, on this permanent cycle of kind of forgotten and then almost rediscovery, but still kind of forgotten. What was it about Hilton that meant that he had to be rediscovered in this way? Why wasn't he Greenwood? Why wasn't he Orwell? Is that a class-based question, or is it around just a kind of industry and publishing question, I guess?
I think it's a combination of those factors, really. So it's class because working class people always get the bum end of the deal, right? George Orwell, who really favorably reviewed this book, he said it was an amazing document. He said that if more people set down their view of life from the working class, it had changed the whole consciousness of our race, is what he said. And he banged on about how important this book was, and they went on to develop a sort of, I think, quite uneasy and probably quite complicated friendship. When Orwell was commissioned to write the Road to Wigan Pier, he wrote to Hilton and asked if he could stay with him in Rochdale. And Hilton said, "You should go to Wigan, because the miners in Wigan are there, like the sort of peak of working class culture. Go there." Essentially, no, you're not coming here. That'd be weird, you know. And so obviously Orwell, his contribution to literature's beyond question. Greenwood, what I think made him a lasting name was that he was willing to play that game. He worked so hard to make Love on the Dole, and it's a brilliant novel. I'm a huge fan. It's not in any way to do it down. He worked so hard to make that novel acceptable to the novel writing public, whilst in many ways not compromising his working class stance, which I think is really commendable. But that book, luck also comes into this a lot. The original proposal to turn Love on the Dole into a film was turned down because it was too radical. Then when the war started, the War Propaganda Office said, "Walter, we need to turn this into a film for propaganda purposes." So he was really, really lucky. What happened with Caliban Shrieks was that it was this remarkable book, brilliantly reviewed, did really well. He went on to write a couple more books, actually, in quick succession. He did incredibly productive, to say he was literally still mastering English as he was already a published writer. Then the war happened, and by the end of the war, Hilton's voice seems really quite dated, and he was basically told that by publishers. And he hadn't had the money and the success that came with film adaptations and very successful stage adaptations of Love on the Dole.
Mm.
So that it was luck really that meant Greenwood and Hilton went in very different directions after their successes in the mid-30s.
I think it's so interesting, just to think for the audience as well. There's, so much of, what we think of as passed down to us as the canon of literature, even a kind of like canon of working class literature in some senses, that we think of as monolithic, but so much of it kind of rests on luck. Or bad luck or good luck, or kind of finding, someone hiding behind a pillar in a pub, kind of saying, no, I know Bill, and kind of that's how it becomes rediscovered. How much of this rests on these little moments. But Jack Chadwick, I wanted to come to you. We've been hearing about how, maybe we can't describe this as a novel. Maybe it's a lot of these different things at once kind of collaged together. But I wonder if there is kind of within that a moment, a kind of section, a chapter potentially that you're kind of really interested in, that you were most drawn to, that you could maybe tell us about, and then we might hear a little bit from it as well. I should say as well that whilst it looks like Jack Chadwick is in Oldham by that background, it's actually a fake background that was superimposed, and they are in fact in Brazil at the minute.
Yeah. I'll just come back to some of the points about where to think about where Hilton fits into that legacy of 1930s proletarian. First of all, I think there's a few examples that you can point to of authors or creators in a similar position to Hilton who've come from a really working class background, done one really big thing, and then sort of had to retreat either on their own terms or because of basically with their last week's news, right? So Sheila Delaney is, I think, probably the most famous one. But then also you've got Andrea Dunbar, whose story is more, we don't have time for it now, but considerably more tragic. What I would also add to that account about Hilton's own experience with his middle class publishers, and middle class is really the wrong word, because a lot of them, there was one in particular, Countess Wedgwood, who was at the top tier of, she was actually one of the nicer ones. She actually, met him in person to tell him with George Orwell that he couldn't, a Greek restaurant in London, that he couldn't, get the book deal that would give him the sort of financial security he needed. That happened in 1940.
They always break bad news to in Greek restaurants in London. That's what I've learned about the publishing industry.
A bit of a tradition down south. I've only ever had good news in a Greek restaurant. So basically, Orwell, Hilton was tugged into writing certain things by the demands of publishers, and they said, okay, so we've published this first work of yours, which is like on a level of bizarreness to sort of even be classed as like primitive art or whatever. It's art produced without the intention of ever seeing the light of day. It's completely its own thing, right? It has no echoes until even the 1970s with sort of punk poetry, but even then it's not the same. But afterwards, when Hilton did want to get his feet under the table, his publishers and the people advising him, who were gatekeeping for money, right? They were pushing him to do what you'd consider more like traditionally the proletarian novel, and those are the forces that led to the two novels that are more sort of typical, like Champion, and they're called Champion and Laugh at Polonius. And then after that, they were like, okay, no, the proletarian novel in that kind of format is dead. What we want you to do, and this is in 1939, just before war broke out, they said, what we want you to do is traipse around England and write a sort of travelogue, which he never wanted to do this. It wasn't his idea, but he was constantly chasing the sort of suggestions of publishers who really liked what he'd done with Caliban Shrieks, but they couldn't bring themselves to say, okay, based on how much we love this shriek of a work, whether you want to call it a novel or not, which I think I love what you say about it, Andrew, in your introduction to it, which is like it runs screaming down the street, like almost as if it's like a Celtic warrior in blue, like body paint or whatever. It screams at you. If he'd been left to his own devices and been given a blank check, I think we probably would have seen things more similar to Caliban Shrieks afterwards. because some of his published writings go they veer off in more interesting places than the stuff that actually came out does. I'm not disputing the fact that English Ways and some of the other things that were published are fantastic, and they retain the same intelligence and the same astuteness, right, about the people that he encounters in these travelogues. But some of his stuff that's unpublished, a lot of which I've not even had a chance to go through yet. I've probably gone through about half of it. Is pulling in sort of almost an obscene direction. We have to remember that in the 30s, there were still these censorious laws forbidding writers from even considering to write about certain things. Britain had one of the most, you couldn't write about prostitution, you couldn't write about things that, were part of these communities. Like the women in Rochdale in the early 1900s, prostitution was rife. You couldn't write about that. You couldn't consider writing about it. There's all these things, all these limitations on what Jack Hilton could write about that we need to bear in mind when we consider the stuff that came after Caliban Shrieks. Caliban Shrieks was produced without this in mind. I mean, we don't really fully know if there could have been more to it without certain things, but those were the factors at play. And I think, to go to your question, Andrew, I think I'd like to pick up on one of my favorite parts of the book, which is where he's talking about his experiences of homelessness.
Yeah.
A few periods of homelessness in the 1920s, like hundreds of thousands of veterans from the First World War. He turned up back in the UK with serious injuries. He'd been injured on the battlefields in 1918 at the Battle of Rosieres, where the Germans broke through and did terrible, just thousands died. He was very lucky. He was homeless in around 1920, and then again around 1921. Blah, blah, blah. So I'll read you an excerpt where he talks about this period. And what I love about this, just to say, is that it's biography, right? But it's the kind of biography where, because he's talking about events that really can't be recalled, like he's talking about remembering memories but he was too hungry to have made. If you're really starving and your only thought in the day is, where am I going to sleep? Is there a chance of a hot meal? You don't remember your activities in that day in the same way as you would if you were fully fed. So it starts off, it's one paragraph. It starts off with a poem by the Irish poet Tom Moore, which he then responds to. And I'll start with that. There is not in the wide world a valley so sweet as that vale in whose bosoms the bright waters meet. And then Hilton, as the tramp, responds, if Moore was like me, with no brogues to his feet, lying down in a barn and having nothing to eat, getting up in the morning to face a cold, driving sleet, he wouldn't give a damn where the bright waters meet. And that's Hilton speaking. And then he goes into the chapter. The lily-painted descriptions of nature by an artist in the throes of a hypnotic rapture is but the expression of dualism of being well-fed and ideally imaginative. The Grecians with their culture belonged to the well-fed minority, while their slave brethren were more or less inexpressive. So it is that we paint pictures according to our stage of evolution. Well-fedness is the objective stimulus for the nice abstract words or canvas painting. A hungry man has a hungry outlook, and little or no interest in the noctambulist wool gatherings of the nature devotee, who raves away, you know how, a sky of silken blue, stuccoed with the gold riplets of sunny tints, above hills of green-brown majesty. Oh, the muck of metaphor! How you kid the soft highfalutin, hungering shop assistants with such stuff, and send them on their Sunday hikes with those back to nature rucksacks. So here you also have that positioning of the text in terms of class. He's talking to people who might actually do this kind of like hiking every weekend thing. And indeed, he later on in his life would have done this kind of thing, right? He was paid to write a book about his walks. So it goes to show the way he's weaving his biography into this constantly shifting position of the text. I love that part.
I think it's really great just to hear, I think, a section of it. And I think I don't mean this to be a glib question, I guess, but thinking about, I'm thinking about our audience here at Off the Shelf, and I'm thinking about there might well be some kind of Jack Hilton fans in the audience who are already ready, who are kind of coming along and kind of, being really excited to kind of hear more depth about things as we've been giving, but there might also be people who are thinking about kind of ordering the book after this chat and things like that. And and it was interesting kind of when the vintage reissue of Caliban Shrieks came out, thinking about the different reactions that there'd been to it. And some reviewers kind of said, actually, this isn't a novel, it's a historical artifact of something, but it's good, it's back in the world. Whereas some people reviewed it incredibly positively, as though it was a kind of contemporary novel. And I just guess my question for both of you is kind of what we see as the kind of use of it, I guess, now that it's kind of in the world again. And I don't mean that as in that art has to be utilitarian, but I guess, is it just a historical document? Is it just interesting to learn about the conditions of the kind of working class and extreme poverty at the time? Or is it also a novel, a piece of literature? I find it at times very funny and just joyous in its language. And so for me, it's always kind of been more than when I first was sent it by Nick at Vintage, who was name checked earlier, found it more than a piece of, a kind of relic of history in that sense of it still speaks to a contemporary moment. But I mean, maybe Jack Windle, I'll come to you first. Just, what we see as its use, I guess, or what it can be now that it's re-emerged in 2024.
I've got a couple of responses to that. I guess my PhD thesis was on 20th century working class literature.
Yes.
For me, it's a really, really important text in that tradition and an absolutely vital addition to it. It adds a completely new dimension, as we've discussed. Very much, it is not just a piece of documentary writing. I say just, it is that, but it's not only that. It's so much more besides. It's definitely very good literary art. It's got like pretty visionary glimpses in it of modes of writing that wouldn't really become a thing for decades. There's like postmodern flavors to quite a lot of this. It's really, really groundbreaking text. So I think that's its kind of literary status, which I'm very, absolutely delighted that its republication means it's got a shot at that status that it deserves. But in terms of its use as well, and again, like I was one of the people to try and get this reissued. I spent years working on it. And 12 years ago, when I was writing the chapter of my thesis on it, I thought that getting it republished would be like the end goal. That'd be amazing. But actually, now it's out in the world, it kind of feels like it's the beginning. There's so much to Hilton's life. You talked about mystery, Jack, at the beginning. There's a lot of unsolved mysteries about this guy's life. This is a guy who had alternative endings to his own life. I've spoken to someone in Wiltshire who told me that they found him dead. They delivered his Meals on Wheels and they found him dead at this cottage in Wilcott in Pewsey. And there's a death notice in the local newspaper. But we also have him in Oldham around the same time. And we haven't got to the bottom of the facts of his life. As I said at the beginning, there are some that we'll never get to the bottom to because they're unknowable. But there's a lot that we can. And the use of this book being out there is that, it's brought, hopefully, the time and the support to get in the archive and uncover anything else that's in there that'll help us to flesh out the details of his life. And who knows, there could be unpublished gems in there. There might not be. There might be a lot of rubbish. We just don't know until someone's had the time to really do that archival work. So to me, it's kind of, I thought it was an end, and actually there's so much more to come out of this for sure.
I love thinking about that this is the doorway into something much bigger. This is just the beginning of something. And Jack C, just before I come to you, Jack Windle, I just wondered if you'd very briefly, I guess, just say a little bit about, if we hadn't known about Hilton, or in your work, in your thesis on kind of 20th century kind of working class literature and the novel, what would we miss without Hilton? Like, what does he give us, both, I think, in a historical sense, but a literary sense, that we wouldn't have if he decided to never write, if that whole kind of confluence of coincidences and events had ever come to pass that you described for us, or if his work had just been lost and never known about. What would be different about kind of our understanding of that time, but also of what would be different in literature, do we think? I know that's a massive question.
It's a really good question. And I think what he brings that wasn't there so much in the literature of the 30s is the voice of, and he refers to himself as the mass man, or the lumpen voice, if you like. And again, it's so difficult always to unpick the differences between the individual and their work, their writing. But the autobiographical stuff, both from Caliban Boswell and that's in Caliban Shrieks, it's clear that he was from a very interesting background. His dad was a very committed Labour Party man. Basically, he met not Keir Starmer.
Keir Starmer, what a twist!
He hadn't met, that would be weird, wouldn't it? He also did time travel. He'd met Keir Hardie as a boy, kind of on the campaign trail and stuff. And his dad was an autodidact. He'd apparently committed a lot of Shakespeare to memory and stuff. So his dad represents that very, very strong working class tradition of political engagement and autodidacticism, which is the genesis of so much of the literature of the period. But his mum was actually sort of quite against some of that stuff, thought books were a bit of a waste of time. And he had that influence of a much more kind of, a much less literary working class culture, if you like. There's a brilliant bit in They Call Themselves Comrades where he's slagging off the book socialists, where he talks about they'll frown at you for committing sins like having a bet on a horse or wanting to mooch a fag off a colleague. And that kind of quite like pious, puritanical working class of the 30s is overrepresented in the literature, and people who come from that kind of background tend to voice it. So your lumpen people are other characters. They're Ned Narky in Love on the Dole. They're bestial, uneducated, stupid people who are kind of in a way to blame for their own position in the class hierarchy. And Hilton's voice is unique in that it blends those two kind of contradictory traditions in working class culture and really gives voice to that more mass position. So for that reason, it adds a whole new dimension, I think, to the working class literature of the 1930s.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jack. And Jack C., I was just thinking, both that questions, again, as Jack Winder was just answering for us there, about what its importance might be in the world now that it's back here in 2024, but also its importance to you as a writer as well, as a kind of creative, kind of to find this, to have gone on this journey, to kind of build on the community work that had already been done to kind of rediscover it and to kind of bring it out into the world, but also then what ripples that might have for your own kind of writing, potentially your own kind of creative life as well.
Yeah, I can honestly say that if I hadn't have been in the library that day, I know exactly where I'd be now. I'd be, I'd be doing the same thing as I'd been doing for years before, which is working in nightclubs in Manchester. Funnily enough, a lot of those nightclubs are in old mill buildings. So similarly to Hilton, you're running about on the floor of these old mills, right? And you're doing it. The only difference is you're doing it in the middle of the night. And I think I would have never put pen to paper in the way that I since then have. And the confidence that I have to do that has come from reading Hilton and also from seeing the response to Hilton and seeing I was really surprised by the response to it. I thought, this was going to be like the private little crusade of myself and a few others like Jack, right, and like Ben Clark. I thought this was, if we got it republished, this would be something that would make a few people really, really happy. But the response to it has shown that Hilton's voice resonates with a far, and I even think that there's a lot of people who would never in a million years buy or read Caliban Shrieks in its republished edition who would love it, right? I'm talking to my friends about it who don't read books, who don't have a clue about literature, as I didn't before this all happened. They are fascinated by it when I tell them what it is and when I give them copies for free, because it's like it's a lot of money, 16, 17 pounds. It's a lot of money actually, to people working minimum wage bar jobs. And it's when they've actually read it and I've given it to them, they've loved it. But I think what I'd like to do is what I'd like to see, and I don't know if it's not just on me to do this, it's on a much wider group of people, is to sort of use Hilton and to use what Hilton proves as a springboard for encouraging people who would never write or who would never read to maybe reconsider that, or to give consideration to reading when they never have, previously. I'll be honest with you, there was a 2-year period in my life where I didn't read books at all, and it just so happened there was the one book that broke that was Caliban Shrieks. And I don't think I've ever mentioned that before, but yeah, no, it's very easy to not read. It's very easy to fall out of it. I used to read as a lad, but I don't know, working hard just did something to my brain that turned off for reading, and that's returned with a vengeance now. So I'm reading voraciously at the moment and have been for the last year or so. But that's also, it's all credit to Hilton. It's all credit to Caliban Shrieks and to this journey. So it's made a huge difference in my life personally. And also, I think it could make a difference to a lot more people. I really do. Not just
I think that's really true. I definitely encourage, therefore, all the audience again who are kind of watching and listening to go out and get a copy of this new vintage edition of Caliban Shrieks. We're coming towards the end of our time, and Jack C, we're going to kind of end on another little reading from Caliban Shrieks if you've got another couple of paragraphs that you want to share with us. But before we do that, I'm always a fan of In Our Time on Radio 4. And I love on the podcast where he goes, now we get some extra material with our guests, just at the very end. So I thought, and then the producer comes in and brings a cup of tea for him. But I thought, as a kind of little extra time thing, because it's such a kind of unwieldy book in some ways, but in a brilliant way, we've kind of thought about all these different layers, all these different voices, all these different things that it might be, I guess, that if I could push you both to kind of sum up in a sentence or two what we think kind of Caliban Shrieks is. And then I'll kind of say a few goodbyes and we'll finish with Jack Chadwick's reading. So Jack Windle, first of all, just a sentence or two about what you think kind of Caliban Shrieks is and why people should leave this event and run straight out and get their copy.
I wish I had time to prepare this. It would probably be a lot better, but here we go. So Caliban Shrieks is an autobiography that's not an autobiography, that tells a story about the 1930s that you definitely haven't heard before. It's really amusing, it's really interesting, and you should definitely rush out and buy a copy. Also, good. I hope that was all right.
That was amazing. Jack C, how about for you? One sentence or two about this book.
God, as you probably can tell, I'm not really good at keeping things short, so I'll try my best. I think for me, it's all I can do is just give you some words. It's northern, it's angry, it's bitter, but it's bitter in a way that is so uniquely northern as to almost look as if it's not bitter, right? It's all of those things, and it's at the same time, it's I keep going back in my head to what you say, Andrew. It's running down the street, screaming, shrieking at people who aren't paying attention to the things that are going on, and these things are still going on, right? And that's what I love about the book is its timelessness, the timelessness of this scream and its targets in particular. It's a little bit passé to be angry about things, but I am.
Good. We should all be angry about a lot of things, I think. I don't think that should feel passé at all. Thank you so much to Off the Shelf Festival for kind of having us together to be able to chat about this marvelous book. To you all for listening, to Jack Windle and Jack Chadwick for sharing their expertise and their insights with us. I feel like I've learned so much in this short time that we've been together, and I wish we could do it for a lot longer. And I loved what Jack Windle was telling us, that this is only the beginning. that this isn't a kind of end of Jack Hilton. This isn't the end of the road. There's going to be more work and more work, hopefully emerging into the world of his that we can read. But it feels only right, I think, that we should end on some more of Jack Hilton's words. It's been great that everyone's been called Jack apart from me as well. That's been really fun because you have to keep using everyone's full names. But we should end with some words from Jack Hilton, I think. And so, Jack Chadwick, have you got something, a little bit of something to leave us with?
So Hilton finishes the book with a toast to the parasites, to the understrappers, to the lackeys of the men in power. And then finally, the toast turns to his fellow workers. And I think we should finish here with a reading from that final part of the toast, which is what ends the book. Here's to you, the army of heavy laden and sweaty bodies, you who are of thirst and fatigue, you who are of industry and not of ambition, inferiors visited by the fleas, the tame mice that the economists practice their art of vivisection upon, the creators of all, the uncouth, the mugs, the seekers of jobs, the possessors of a painful quality of endurance, the dumb and inarticulate, the men of fustian, the cream of the earth, here's to you. Whatever I have said or writ or done, either by act or deed, in ignorance or reason, whether I sincerely believe it to be right or otherwise, and if by examination now or in the dim and distant future, it is found to be true or otherwise, not commendable in your best interests, or not unduly biased in your favour, I, here and now, without equivocation or qualification, irrevocably withdraw and allow you, the assaulters of the earth, the men of the horny hands, to substitute anything however alien to me in its place. I accept you, general masses, howling mobs, beastly blondes. You are infallible, impeccable, and always right.